What a splendid crowd. I'm enjoying the view already. It's a great pleasure to be here. My first visit to Halle, though Eric and I have known each other for a while. At the same time, I feel I'm a slight, what can I say, charlatan in this world. It's true I'm American, but I don't work on American culture. I think my qualifications for this international experience, this international honor, have to do with the fact that I've become a great lover of Germany, especially Berlin. It's been very important to me to become ein Wahlberliner and to learn that I am a Wahlberliner. I have recently published a book called Berlin for Jews, which is a book about why I love Berlin, because it's the most Jewish place I know. Maybe outside of West End Avenue in Manhattan. And so what I'm about to talk about is part of a large book project. Whose title is indeed this title. And it is to be understood as part of a sort of project. It's really the beginning ideas for a book about eating and drinking in pre-modern culture in Europe. Exhibit 1. Several years ago, I published a book in which I argued that the 15th and 16th century discovery of ancient art objects buried in the soil of Rome was the key to a whole set of operations around history, culture, and artistic production. A crucial monument in this story took place on January 14th, 1506, when a Roman citizen digging up the Esquiline hill in order to plant a vineyard happened to come upon the statue of the Laocoon. The particulars of this event are known to us from an eyewitness account written 60 years later by Francesco da San Gallo, himself an architect and sculptor. In this now famous letter, he detailed the emergence of the statue, the presence of Michelangelo as a bystander, and the identification of the work based on Pliny's account of it in the Natural History. Other scholars had also focused on this episode, but the payoff that I especially wish to extract appeared at the end of the document. Then they dug the hole wider so that they could pull the statue out. As soon as it was visible, everyone started to draw, all the while discoursing on ancient things, chatting as well about the ones in Florence. It was this last pair of activities, which begins as soon as the statue is completely extracted, that fascinated me. San Gallo and the other onlookers, I wrote, respond in two ways. They draw and they talk. End quote. And in effect, I generated the succeeding 450 pages of my book. This is not a lightweight volume. I generated the succeeding 450 pages of my book out of that combination. They draw and they talk. The only trouble is that I may have translated it wrong. Once the Laocoon is visible, says San Gallo, ci tornammo a desinare. We turn, presumably from a direct contemplation of the statue, to desinare. It's a piece of 16th century spelling, and I understood it, as many others had, as disegnare, that is, to draw. Hence my nice little phrase, they draw, they talk. But there's another possible meaning of desinare. In Tuscan Italian, it could be the equivalent of digiunare. In other words, to break the fast, to eat a meal. So we're left with two quite different pictures of what happened on the occasion of this momentous discovery. Which ending did San Gallo choose for this story? Either they dug up the Laocoon and proceeded to have an art class, or they dug up the Laocoon and proceeded to have lunch. Exhibit 2. In principle, at least, the Greeks distinguished rigorously between two phases of a formal meal. First came the deipnon, with many and varied courses of food, and then the symposion, which was principally devoted to drink, as the word itself, sum puino, drink together, suggests. This latter phase could move onward into the wee hours with loose talk or even to erotic activity involving the visits of slave girls, heteras, and the like. How then shall we contemplate and understand the most famous symposium of all, scripted by Plato, in which Socrates and his learned colleagues quite soberly discuss the nature of love? One path to an understanding would have to travel through the opening pages of the dialogue. in which there are only the vaguest references to love, but a plethora of references to dinner, including who got invited or didn't get invited, the introduction of Socrates as a guest who brings another person along but arrives late himself, and a description of the officially sanctioned arrangement of the dining couches. Most particularly, though, in this phase, there's a discussion about drink. The symposia seem to be pursuing a quite canonical structure for the meal. Having concluded the eating portion of the occasion, quote, they poured a libation to the god, sang a hymn, and, in short, followed the whole ritual. Then they turned their attention to drinking, end quote. But this attention, it turns out to be mostly devoted to how they won't be drinking. Both Pausanias and Aristophanes, it turns out, among the guests, already have hangovers from the night before. Agathon is also a bit worse for wear. He just won the Panathenian Prize. And the physician Eryximachus is prepared to offer a medical lecture about the evils of alcohol, which blessedly we are spared in Plato's text. They also agree to dismiss the flute girl, whose sensuous entertainment is of a piece with heavy drinking. What sort of occasion is this then? Plutarch later will triumphantly point out that the food consumed on symposiast occasions leaves nothing but, quote, yesterday's smell, whereas the words of philosophy remain eternally fresh. And that, he says, is why the symposium, Plato's symposium, includes no account of the menu, but only the conversation. It's my job to bring that kind of thing back. Nevertheless, Plato has designed a narrative in which the most transcendent of philosophical matters is framed around a meal. The deipnon, or eating phase of the evening, is duly, if briefly, chronicled. But the drinking phase that is supposed to follow, though coyly offered as a possibility, is cancelled in favor of rigorous teetotaling and some apparently contrary set of activities. Yet if the alcoholic phase does not take place, why is the dialogue given the name of a drinking party? Exhibit 3. The great philosopher of a later age, for once in this talk I go German, the great philosopher of a later age, Immanuel Kant, spent some years developing a set of lectures that would eventually become anthropology from a pragmatic point of view. Neither exactly anthropological nor pragmatic in the modern senses, these lectures represent Kant's wish to branch out from the world of purely abstract philosophical reasoning, of metaphysics or epistemology, in favor of something closer to a description of human activity, especially cognition, as it actually takes place. Throughout his work in both these areas, Kant was intensely concerned with aesthetics, and especially aesthetic judgments. In the critique of judgment, the ruminations are at base abstract and logical. His anthropology, on the other hand, aspires to describe and analyze actual human processes. So he's less interested in the validity of aesthetic judgments than in the human faculties that produce them. The term that encapsulates aesthetic judgment and human subjectivity is inevitably taste. And Kant remains sufficiently a philosophical systematizer to be searching for universals in this apparently individualist realm. Nun wird aber auch das Wort Geschmack, he writes in a section entitled On the Feeling for the Beautiful, für ein sinnliches Beurteilsvermögen genommen. Nicht bloß nach der Sinnesempfindung für mich selbst, sondern auch nach einer gewissen Regel zu wählen, die als für jedermann geltend vorgestellt wird. He proceeds to do quite a bit of philosophical heavy lifting around the conflict between individual judgments and universal rules, citing, for instance, the distinct traditions of the Germans versus the English as regards the way they begin their meals, the Germans preferring soup, the English solid foods. But the whole matter of taste, once it's made its transit through mealtime, requires of Kant that a separate Anmerkung be appended to this section, a practice he does not follow anywhere else in the Anthropology. Wie mag es doch gekommen sein, Kant begins his Anmerkung, dass vornehmlich die neueren Sprachen das ästhetische Beurteilsvermögen mit einem Ausdruck Gustus, Sapor, der bloß auf ein gewisses Sinnenwerkzeug, das Innere des Mundes, bezeichnet haben. It's worth paying special attention to that bloß, in Kant's search to find a through line between aesthetics and universals, to offer a philosophical account of taste. The inside of the mouth looms threateningly. Why indeed should that particular bodily sensation, whether generated by German cabbage soup or English soused mackerel, have become archetype and eponym for so many aesthetic experiences of greater importance than anything produced by mere amuse-bouche. Exhibit 4. We'll get back to all these exhibits, fear not. In 1435, Leon Battista Alberti produced his highly influential treatise on painting, which he wrote first in Latin and then translated with some changes into Italian. In a quite brief stretch of pages, Alberti celebrates the glories of painting, covers technical issues in representation and perspective, and enunciates up-to-date rules for pictorial decorum. In particular, he canonizes a certain kind of narrative composition, which he calls a historia, endowing it with cultural significance very much along the lines that Horace bestowed on poetry in his Ars Poetica. Laying down the guidelines for this composition, Alberti arrives at questions having to do with what he calls compositio. He doesn't like a picture to be too empty or too crowded, and he goes on to say, in a historia, I strongly approve of the practice I see observed by the tragic and comic poets of telling their story with as few characters as possible. In my opinion, there will be no historia so rich in variety of things that 9 or 10 men cannot worthily perform it. Alberti here is drawing an analogy between the number of characters in a classical drama and the number of bodies in a painting. The parallel makes sense. He is, after all, talking about narrative. And the ancient dramas with which he may have been familiar, say Terence and Seneca, could well stand as paradigms for economy of storytelling, readily transferable from the 3 dimensions of the theater to the 2 dimensions of panel paintings. We are, in other words, witnessing a logical shift from one aesthetic medium to another. In a familiar intermedial mode, he wishes to garner some of the prestige accorded to classical text and transfer it to modern painting. But Alberti does not close with this theatrical analogy. Having established the limit of 9 or 10 persons in a painting on the authority of the ancient dramatists, he caps off the discussion by saying, I think Varro's dictum is relevant here. He allowed no more than 9 guests at dinner to avoid disorder. The swerve from Sophocles to the dinner table, surprising in itself, becomes even more striking when we look back at Alberti's source. He hasn't actually read Varro. He couldn't have, since that text was already lost and remained so. Instead, he has drawn this classical injunction from its citation in the Attic Nights of Aulus Gellius, one of those pedantic and meandering compendia that acted as a sort of late antique Wikipedia, ever able to furnish humanists with classical exempla. In the context of the Attic Nights, Varro's opinion about dinner parties is not an analogy for something else, as it is in Alberti. It is simply advice about dinner parties. But within that text, the prescription regarding hospitality is itself justified by analogies. The number of the guests, says Varro, or so Aulus Gellius tells us he says, ought to begin with that of the Graces and end with that of the Muses, in other words, between 3 and 9. It seems as though Alberti, the lawgiver for painting, has found the justification for one of his rules in a gastronomic context that itself sought authority from the classical subjects of Graces and Muses. Graces and Muses, of course, are time-honored pictorial subjects in their own right. But Alberti ignores painterly practice as an exemplum for painting and instead reaches around to the dinner table. He also has to sidestep the fact that paintings of actual dinners within his own culture, say Last Suppers or marriages at Cana and so forth, could scarcely ever be squeezed into the numbers of Varro's guest list. On the other hand, dozens of panel paintings in the Albertian tradition, often sacred altarpieces, whose subjects have nothing whatever to do with mealtime, end up following his dinner-inflected prescription, though without looking anything like dinner parties. Exhibit 5. For his final expanded edition of 1568, Giorgio Vasari composed almost 200 artists' lives. Not all of them were Donatello's and Raphael's, of course. When a biography needed to be fleshed out, he often had recourse either to anecdotal material or to the recounting of personality traits that turned the portrait into something like a humoral character sketch. In the case of Giovan Francesco Rustici, Vasari interrupts the customary sequence of career milestones, apprenticeship, commissions won or lost, works produced, etc., with an account of Rustici's membership in a circle of artist gourmets. On one evening in that company, for instance, Vasari tells us, the contribution of Rustici was a cauldron in the form of a pie, in which was Ulysses dipping his father in order to make him young again. He got that wrong, it's Jason, but who's counting? Which two figures were boiled capons that had the form of men. So well were the limbs arranged, and all with various good things to eat. Andrea del Sarto presented an octagonal temple, similar to that of San Giovanni, but raised upon columns. The pavement was a vast plate of jelly, with a pattern of mosaic in various colors. The columns, which had the appearance of porphyry, were sausages, long and thick. The sockles and capitals were of Parmesan cheese, the cornices of sugar, and the tribune was made of sections of marchpane. In the center was a choir desk made of cold veal, with a book of lasagna. That's the book I want to read. I think I often do. That had the letters and notes of the music made of peppercorns. And the singers at the desk were cooked thrushes, standing with their beaks open and with certain little shirts after the manner of surplices, made of fine calls of pigs. And behind them, for the basses, were two fat young pigeons with 6 ortolans that sang the soprano. The above, it should be noted, is a small fraction of Vasari's full gastroekphrasis, which runs to nearly half of the 7,500-word biography of Rustici. It may well be that this interlude is a compensation for the second or third class status of Rustici as an artist. But how do these bizarre culinary enterprises relate to the central concerns of Vasari's lives, that is, artists making art? Sixth and final exhibit. Actually, there'll be another one at the end. At the final Salon of 1747, François Boucher exhibited a painting whose subject derived from a pastoral entertainment composed by his friend Charles-Simon Ferrard. In one of the episodes that Boucher illustrated, an amorous shepherd plays the flute for his beloved. In the other, far more famous picture, this one, she feeds him grapes. As with many works of Rococo, simplicity is achieved here by quite a lot of complication. In this case, a cross between realistic details of country life and full-dress, classical-style pastoral. Unshod and slightly grimy feet thus keep company with an elaborate multicolored frock. And elegantly idealized human figures have as bookends some shaggy goats on one side and pudgy sheep on the other. We would not be talking about this picture were it not for the fact that it comes with a title. Pense-t-il au raisin? Are they thinking of the grapes? But the title is also a problem. We cannot be certain that it was authorial, but whether Boucher is responsible or not, this painting comes down to us wedded to a notably provocative label. The titular question guides our viewing quite specifically. In pursuit of an answer, we focalize on the lady holding a bunch of grapes in her left hand and placing a single grape before the mouth of her lover with her right hand. The grapes lead us to some interesting places on the picture. His mouth, her breast. Yet that visual itinerary turns out to provide a striking counterplot to the story we might have followed without the benefit of such a title. That is, the passionate trajectory of vision between the two lovers, which in fact bypasses the grapes altogether. In the end, though, it doesn't really matter. Whether we follow the eyes or the grapes, the message is the same. The cigar, in this case, is not just a cigar. In fact, it's scarcely a cigar at all. With this image in front of us and the question, are they thinking of the grapes, having been posed, we know the answer, hell no. Who would be thinking of grapes at a time like this? Well, I am. Looking back then, it seems that in at least one strand of what we might loosely call the classical tradition, eating and drinking appear to play the role, I hope this word has traveled to Germany, the role of photobomb. This is the best photobomb I could find online. That is to say, the unwanted appearance of something in the middle of a picture. So they too are muscling their way into the picture, eating and drinking, when matters of grander import are supposed to be on view. Socrates and his fellow truth seekers do everything they can to guarantee the seriousness of their enterprise, but it is folded into the structure of an evening meal. And that brings up the inevitable prospect of inebriation. Kant is struck with the term taste, and he's far too sensitive a ponderer of linguistic undermeanings to be able to dismiss its origins on the tongue, though it troubles him. Alberti, for his part, freely chooses the dinner analogy, but it too is troubling. What effect does it have on his plan to bestow prestige on painting? And how well does the idea of mealtime sort with the kind of earnest subject matter, whether classical or Christian, that his Historia is designed to promote? And what happens when Vasari places artistic composition via caul fat and marzipan in competition with such media as marble and bronze? Similarly, why should Boucher insert a piece of fruit in his pastoral love story? If they're not thinking of the grapes, why should I be? And while we're on the subject of me, why did I, with a lifetime of interest in food and drink and a pretty good knowledge of early modern Italian, if I say so myself, completely overlook one very plausible meaning of desinare? Consider those grapes to begin with. The lovers, we can agree in answer to the titular question, are not thinking about them, but the viewers are forced to. Boucher's problem, I'm cutting through a great many centuries and practices in the visual arts, not to mention in life in general, is that he's not permitted to represent sex itself. We might look at any amorous pair of persons in a painting and allow our imaginations to wander off the canvas in more erotic directions than the conventions of representation themselves permit. In this case, the grapes, especially when they are represented in both image and word, are the vehicle that takes us there. We could take the grapes in many directions. The pagan Dionysus, or the Christian Eucharist, just for starters, and somewhere in the book they turn up. But for Boucher's medium, there's a foundational story about grapes. In the natural history, Pliny tells us how the 4th century BC Greek painter Zeuxis boasted that his painting of grapes was so real that birds flew down to peck at them. Whereupon his contemporary painter Parrhasius handed him now you really can be thinking of the grapes, or not thinking of the grapes. Pliny tells us how Zeuxis boasted that his painting of grapes was so real that birds flew down to peck at them. Whereupon his contemporary Parrhasius handed him a newly executed work of his own. "Let me just open the curtain and see the picture," said Zeuxis, only to realize that the curtain he was about to draw aside was, in fact, the painting. Though Zeuxis had deceived birds, Parrhasius had deceived a human, and an artist no less. A Boucher-like tease is going on here. In this case, grapes versus curtains. The representation of the grapes is, to be sure, marvelous, and yet, however grandiose a compliment Pliny is paying to Zeuxis, it is clearly outdone by the compliment to Parrhasius. In fact, it's all about food. You'll see that in this project, everything, in the end, is all about food. This one is all about food. The birds revealed the limitations of their aesthetic sense, and thereby the limitation of Zeuxis's aesthetic ambitions, because they want to eat the grapes, rather than admire the artistic talent that produced them. They're the ones who are really thinking of the grapes. And of course, they can't eat the grapes because they're painted. Zeuxis loses this contest to Parrhasius, who operates on a higher human level of visual production and reception. And the point about the winning painting, which is simply of a curtain that pretends to be in front of a painting, is that what it offers is precisely nothing. The second-class artist represents food, and so long as he limits himself to the real, and as is often the case, food is the very embodiment of the real, he is sentenced to a subordinate status, as Plato so influentially argued in the Republic. The first-class artist, on the other hand, represents nothing but the act of representing, which is understood as immeasurably higher than such a consumable object as a bunch of grapes. Boucher has, in fact, produced his own Parrhasius painting. He is drawing, as it were, a curtain across a scene that cannot be represented. Edible grapes, though somehow essential, are nevertheless a waste product, a mere signpost on the way either, depending on the story you're telling, to love or to art. Boucher's painting is all about grapes, at least in my view. Vasari's lives are all about art. Food, however, rears its head aggressively in the life of Rustici, where Vasari enumerates something like 50 participants, named each one, in these culinary games. Yet every one of these extravagant creations consists of work that is precisely of the kind a project Renaissance artists were executing with their normal, that is to say, their non-edible artistic materials. Some are architecture, the Florentine baptistry is mentioned above, and later what appears to be a Vitruvian colossus with ground plan columns, architraves, etc. Other works produced at these dinners are figural, like narrative paintings, depictions of pagan hell with appropriate tormentors and monstrous beasts, or pagan heaven with the gods of Olympus in their accustomed iconography. Everything is made of food. What happens then when, instead of pigment and marble, a crowd of Florentine masters is working in tripe and ricotta? This parody of artistic creativity serves to remind us and the participants that all the materials of art making are humble products of the earth, and that the creation of masterpieces is equally miraculous, whether the constituent parts are rocks from Carrara or cheese from Parma. In fact, the scene revives the drama of verisimilitude. By this moment in the history of art, and in Vasari's lives, we may be quite weary of that Zeuxis miracle. Grapes so real that birds peck at them, portraits so real they seem to breathe, statues so real they seem to speak. This new medium, this culinary medium, ups the difficulty factor and makes mimesis a miracle once again. Painting lifelike food is all very well, but creating grand representational works from food, that's another story. Yet there is something less celebratory going on here as well. If food is parallel to pigment and marble, it is also, by comparison, radically abject. After all, as Vasari presents it, Rustici, Andrea del Sarto, and the rest not only construct these things out of lasagna, caul fat, etc., they also destroy them. In fact, the eating in these scenes is always described in terms of demolition. The lower story of one building, the revelers decide, is badly constructed, so they break it apart and feast on the pastry and liver, which were its construction materials. Then they go after a huge column, devouring the Parmesan cheese base and the capital made of capon, veal, and tongues. When the raw materials, or should we say cooked materials, shift to the edible, they also enact a mutability that is vastly more disturbing than the contemporary Renaissance romance of long-term artistic decay, generally focused on antiquity. With this transfer in medium to the culinary medium and the violence that accompanies it, I won't say that these artists are defecating Florence, quite, but they're certainly tearing it to pieces. What is that far-fetched analogy to the dinner party doing for Alberti as he attempts to canonize a certain vision of modern narrative art? Why not stick with the chartering offered by ancient dramas that he offers too? And why ignore the equally useful examples of graces, graces, who cares, of graces and muses? The passage that ends up with the comparison to Vasari's dinner parties begins, Odi solitudinem in historia. I hate solitude in paintings. And though he goes on to say that he hates excessive crowding as well, it's nevertheless clear that his recourse to a gastronomic analogy relates to a kind of pleasure principle that is only partly kept in check by all the formal limitations that he's imposing. Graces and muses, with their canonically limited numbers and their orderly dances, are all very well. Dinner parties, however, even if you limit the numbers, may get out of hand, as is clear from Alberti's reference just a couple of pages earlier to the disastrous wedding party brawl between the centaurs and the Lapiths. But it's precisely the symbolic image of food that insists on pushing against all these structures on decorum. Just as with food and music, he says, novel and extraordinary things delight us for various reasons, but especially because they are different from the old ones we are used to. So with everything, the mind takes great pleasure in variety and abundance. So in painting, variety of bodies and colors is pleasing. I would say that a picture was richly varied if it contained a properly arranged mixture of old men, youths, boys, matrons, maidens, children, domestic animals, dogs, birds, horses, sheep, buildings, and provinces. Food and music, in other words, present themselves here as bringing something to the painter's party that those ancient dramatists, with all their classical and literary prestige, didn't offer. And that hugely copious list of possible subject matters confirms the need for a kind of pleasure principle. After all, you could never accommodate such a menagerie from old men to provinces on a canvas if you stuck to the number of graces or the number of the muses. the taste of food and the experience of dining, refracted across the gap between antiquity and the Renaissance, offer an insistent alternative to an orderliness that, however philosophically praiseworthy, risks taking the form of that hated solitude. Odi solitudinem in historia is not only about paintings. After all, you can also read it as I hate solitude in history. Couldn't we say that the whole humanist project of rebirthing the past is an attempt to counteract loneliness by means of a transhistorical dinner party? Kant, as it turns out, has his mind on dinner parties as well, though he comes to them via a different, and I would say even more circuitous route. Given the terms of his argument, Kant is in fact up against what looks like an insoluble logical dilemma. When the subject of aesthetics transits from the philosophical world of the critique to what he calls the anthropological world, that is, of actual human processes, the concept of taste, with all its grandly abstract meanings, can no longer be separated from the inside of the mouth, which would be well and good were it not for the fact that Kant is still looking for universals. For a non-philosopher like me, there is some pleasure in watching Kant squirm his way through this problem. What could be more fun than Kant squirming? The dinner party, as I've just mentioned it, is his first proposal for a solution. Es ist keine Lage, wo Sinnlichkeit und Verstand in einem Genusse vereinigt, so lange fortgesetzt und so oft mit Wohlgefallen wiederholt werden können, als eine gute Mahlzeit in guter Gesellschaft. But he immediately recognizes that the mouth is hardly essential to this account of taste. One does not, after all, choose dinner guests by means of one's taste buds, or even one's guests' taste buds. The host, he goes on to say, has taste in choosing the guests, which has still nothing to do with the inside of the mouth, and the guests enjoy a variety of tastes, which is quite the opposite of the universals Kant is looking for. Finally, he has recourse to a sort of proto-Darwinian linguistic argument. Sapor, or flavor, is related, he says, truly, correctly, to sapientia, wisdom. The human species, it turns out, possesses a sense, taste, which instinctually identifies that which is wholesome and repels that which is noxious. Nice try, Kant. And it may work for Königsberger Klopse, my own favorite dish from his hometown. But good luck explaining the allure of oysters, vindaloo, and durian. I'm sure they're all for dinner tonight. In fact, Kant's struggles here illustrate just how difficult it is for food to be comfortably included in any kind of rules governing aesthetics. On this point, I believe we have to follow a far less philosophically sophisticated dictum than anything in Kant's oeuvre. Our old friend de gustibus non est disputandum. It's a phrase of no great classical pedigree. It may not even be classical. But in my view, it quite clearly answers Kant's question why the aesthetic faculty of judging should get stuck with the inside of the mouth as its standard bearer. Our relation to food, specifically our relation to food as regards pleasure, is radically individualistic. And the metaphor that transfers the experience of the mouth to the appreciation of Mozart and Masaccio and Milton, though it denies Kant's universalism by operating via one set of taste buds at a time, nevertheless has the virtue of binding individuals to their favorite art objects as though these works were actually being consumed within their bodies and producing nourishment. Plato's problem is different from Kant's problem, as we'll see. But eating and drinking, in this case especially drinking, get interposed here as well. In the account of Plato's work that comes down to us under the category of philosophy, the symposium consists of a series of speeches, for the most part of steadily increasing validity, that build toward a kind of summa on the subject of love, attaining step by step increasing levels of philosophical rigor and ecstatic sublimity. The crescendo culminates in the speech of Socrates, which attains its climax by the yet higher level of wisdom represented by his absent interlocutrix, Diotima. But this account of the symposium as panel discussion does not pay nearly enough attention to the insistent presence of the collective dining experience. As we have seen, the event calls itself a symposium, but the traditional sympathetic activity of drinking is banned. Yet the ban fails. Plato has, in fact, framed the narrative in such a manner that the repressed insists on returning with a vengeance. To begin with, there is a case of the hiccups. The order of speakers has been determined to follow precisely the placement of the individuals on their couches, which in itself suggests that the rules of the banquet are imposing themselves on the rules of the philosophical disputation. But that order gets violated when it comes to Aristophanes' turn, because he has suddenly been afflicted with hiccups. It's obviously fitting that a comic playwright should have a comic affliction. In fact, not only are the hiccups a generally deflationary move, with the spiritual reconnected to the physical, they are also specifically connected to drinking, for the Greeks as well as for us moderns. So the philosophical symposium is, at least temporarily, derailed by a feature of the vinous symposium that it supposedly is not. And only a doctor, whose name Eryximachus translates as belch-fighter, can perform the temporary job of filling in. Well, Aristophanes may have been secretly tippling in defiance of the rules, and may get ousted by his eructation. But someone else, who was so far off stage, has been engaging in symposiastic activity that is far more drastic. Just when Socrates has reached the pinnacle afforded by the ladder of love, that sheds all reference to individual desire in an ecstasy of contemplating heavenly beauty, the proceedings are interrupted by noises from outside, as a large party of revelers arrives in the courtyard and demands to be admitted. The intruder at the non-feast is, of course, Alcibiades, drunk. Once he has crashed the sober precincts of the panel discussion, he completely monopolizes the conversation. The teetotaling philosophers, earlier in the dialogue, offered one version of their subject, turning the argument, which was to praise love or praise the God of love, into something increasingly abstract. The intoxicated interloper, on the other hand, recounts the experience of love, which turns out to be a portrait of Socrates, and it has the effect of completely undermining some of the fundamental premises of the whole previous discussion concerning the orderly, one might even say scholastic, distinction between lover and beloved. Inebriation turns out to be not an accident, but a necessity in the economies of this tale. Plato's problem, an issue that stretches far beyond this one dialogue, is that he cannot quite decide whether the truth should be revealed via dialectic or via inspiration. Shall a sequence of speeches delivered by learned and sober gentlemen, each building on what has gone before, arrive at the truth about love? Even prior to Alcibiades' entrance, this process is evidently not sufficient in the context of the symposium, since it requires the intervention in absentia of the priestess Diotima to reach its ecstatic peak. But that peak is not ecstatic enough, or at least not wholly sufficient. Without strong drink, the philosophers are impaired in their search to define love, en oino aletheia, which we know better as in vino veritas. But the veritas, for our purposes, depends on the whole narrative structure of the dialogue. Plato's symposium is for me the master narrative about eating and drinking. These two activities, nutritionally and socially vital but held in comparatively low esteem, the comparison in this case being to the earnest practice of philosophy as sober disputation, these activities get shunted to the margins, as mutatis mutandis do Alberti's dinner party, Vasari's edible art, and Boucher's grapes. But they refuse to tolerate their banishment, and they exert pressure on the center. Alcibiades crashes the temperance meeting, and in the process brings in the truth. This, then, is a story about high culture and low culture, about centers and peripheries, about the return of the repressed. I take it for granted that in the realm where I am operating, and uniformly across a couple of millennia, the business of eating and drinking finds itself valued, at least officially, at a lower position than many other cultural activities, and that this comparative valuation is likelier to be taken as a given rather than submitted to investigative reasoning. From certain points of view, this assumption can certainly be challenged. Eating and drinking are obviously more essential to the human organism than unearthing ancient sculpture or philosophizing about love. And those who find themselves closer to that realm of necessity, not only starving masses, but also everyday managers of households, and perhaps even certain monarchs like James I of England or Catherine de' Medici of France, who governed via banquet-style entertainments, all of these people have every reason to declare that my assumption about the presumed inferior status of food and drink is flawed from the get-go. To those, I can only say that the discussion of these assumptions in the book will inevitably involve some questioning of them. Mostly I don't question them, however, because I come to this subject matter from a lifetime of cross-disciplinary concern, historical and transhistorical, with European high culture. For me, that has meant above all literature and the visual arts, professionally, and music as a passionate avocation. But if one spends one's lifetime dealing seriously with aesthetic objects, not merely as a consumer, but also as a scholar, there's an inevitable trail attached to them of history, philosophy, politics, statecraft, and all the life-affirming or life-denying circumstances that adorn or litter the past. Food and drink appear in every one of these enterprises, and I'm willing to declare, at least by way of an opening premise for my work in this field, that by and large, wherever food and drink appear, the position officially assigned to them is likely to be on the margins. I read for the food, as my title expresses it, in order to locate it on those margins and bring it closer to the center. With that in mind, I close with one last exhibit. Though the medium of mosaic enjoyed enormous diffusion in late antiquity, Pliny the Elder, to whom we owe virtually everything we know about visual production in the Greek and Hellenistic worlds, has rather little to say about it. He does, however, cite one master and one masterpiece. The highest excellence has been attained by Sosus, who laid at Pergamus the mosaic pavement known as the Asarotos Oikos, from the fact that he there represented, in small squares of different colors, the remnants of a banquet lying upon the pavement, and other things which are usually swept away with the broom, they having all the appearance of being left there by accident. Sosus' mosaic, of course, has long since disappeared, as is the case with most of Pliny's favorite art objects. The best extant version, produced 300 or 400 years after Sosus' time, is a sizable work that adorned the dining room of a villa on Rome's Aventine Hill. Now preserved in the Museo Gregorio Profano at the Vatican, the mosaic consists of segments from three sides of a border, plus a small chunk of the central design. Most of the broad border space is occupied by a stunningly varied array of discarded foodstuffs: fish skeletons and fins, lobster claws, shells from many different kinds of bivalves, including several especially picturesque furry urchins, chicken legs and feet, olive pits, bunches of grapes picked almost clean, bean pods, dates, nuts, lettuce leaves, and most strikingly, an almost empty walnut shell. And this is some of them. I didn't give you all of these lovely details. There it is. An almost empty walnut shell with a mouse gnawing away at the meager edible remains. The unswept floor is a monument to the possibilities of rendering edibles as art. Tessellated mosaic, which uses vast quantities of tiny stones and glass and so forth, is itself made from materials which, were it not for the existence of this art form, would be the invisible dross of the earth. In that sense, all such works, even when far less ambitious than the unswept floor, are masterpieces of illusion that nevertheless retain, as paint generally does not, the visible record of their lowly constituent origins. Mostly, though, when we look at a piece of mosaic like this, we don't see bits of landfill. We see their transformation into uncannily authentic representations. The glowing white background, the perfect verisimilitude of every object, the placement of each in its own autonomous space, even with a scale independent of the scale of the objects around it, and my favorite touch of all, the tiny shadow that each figure casts. Not exactly easy to do in mosaic. All of these artistic choices are lavished upon the materials of dinner, or rather, the ex-materials of dinner. What does all this mean about food? The unswept floor floats between two ancient modes. On the one hand, there is the representation. Let me give us more of the unswept floor. On one hand, there is the representation in both mosaic and pigment of edible treats that look good enough to eat. In this sense, food counts as a prime site for depicting the real, suggesting a seamless flow between actual experience and artistic imaging. On the other hand, we see here a reflection of the ancient Roman obsession with the abject. In this case, it offers us a portrait of man, the consuming animal. Yeah, why do I not give you more of this? Of man, the consuming animal. Via the conceit embodied in the mosaic, food effects its triumphant journey from the margins to the center, from the despised object of waste to the crowning glory of art. Food is about materiality. It is about quotidian experience. Further, as is clear from its operations in the mosaic's jeu d'esprit, food is subject to everything Johann Huizinga had in mind with the phrase homo ludens. Food is, at least potentially, playful. And then there are the more complicated implications. It is ugly and beautiful at once, which is to say that it is capable of being corporeal in the basest sense, at the same time that it is subject to the highest degree of aestheticization. In addition, if it is material, it is also ephemeral, indeed subject to swift and distasteful decay, well beyond even its decimated condition here, if one may allude, as the Romans love to do, to what we should call further stages in the digestive process. Except for the paradox in this highly artificialized mosaic that food, at its most ephemeral, is in fact being immortalized. The unswept floor is a kind of metonymy for my work on reading for the food, in the brilliant conceit of this mosaic. In this mosaic, food is represented by absence, by what is missing, what has already been consumed. What we're looking at here is, in some sense, the reciprocal of banqueting. We are reading the experience of consumption from its after effects. I also take note of the fact that objects on this floor are in a state of radical disconnection. Though the ancient meal may have possessed a rigorous set of ordering principles, the waste products that follow from the meal have no such order, or else they seek their own alternative order. If in this project I sometimes take quite seriously things that are seemingly not there, and if I shy away from traditional systems of ordering via calendar and geography, as I have today, I hope I will be granted the privilege of my own occasionally unswept computer screen, itself quite literally a 21st century mosaic. Thank you.